Hi, you guys. I know we missed the Russian Revolution, but I'm going to give you my little spiel on the Russian Revolution. I call it the birth of communism in the modern era, in particular because it's the first communist regime built on the ideas of Karl Marx. So we're not talking about just any old communism or a communal arrangement, which you could probably find back in history at any time, but a communist regime who followed the ideals of Marxism. All right, so what happens? The Tsar loses confidence of the nation, but why? And there's a few things that occur that start to affect the Tsarist regime's, the people's vision of the Tsarist regime. Number one, Russia goes to war against Japan in the Sea of Japan, and the Japanese will defeat the Russians in 1904, and that really was a crisis for the Tsar. In 1905, Bloody Sunday occurs when workers looking for higher wages, better conditions in labor, and students marched on the Winter Palace, and the guards at the Winter Palace killed some of the students, and that was Bloody Sunday. But they will create the October Manifesto. They will write the government will write the October Manifesto, and the October Manifesto guaranteed freedoms, much like you would find in your first 10 amendments, and that the Duma, an elected body, would be the author of at least some legislation, although it did not give full power to the Duma. It definitely gave elective representation to the Duma. Also going on in Russia in this period were the Stolypin reforms. Stolypin was a minister in Russia who wanted constitutional monarchy and capitalist free market activity. And he's significant for that reason, that he was trying to create a Western society as opposed to what the Marxists was doing, which is to create a whole new communist society. And I realize that communism, as it is defined by Marx, comes out of the West, but Russia is the first place that they will try to implement a communist regime. Stolypin was just the opposite. He was constitutional monarchy and a system similar to most of the Western countries, but especially since you have the United States like us, right? Free market, right? So he ends communes, and here in this picture you can see that they are signing papers as they've divided up the commune into private plots, and the peasants are getting their private plots. Stolypin would be assassinated in 1911, and he was really the voice in government that could have really pushed the government in a direction towards free market and constitutionalism. And so in 1911, he was gone, right? And there was no other voice in government with such influence, right? So the government returns to despotism after a short period of efforts for reform. The Tsar, actually, Nicholas II, seems to have become somewhat reactionary after a period of trying to reform conditions in Russia, right? So there you have in the right at the turn of the century, before 1911, a Russia who's headed sort of on a Western path, and then bam, the World War I breaks out, right? And then all the disaster for Russia in World War I. It really, for all intents and purposes, wasn't a nation that was ready to fight. It wasn't what the Germans thought, that they wouldn't be able to mobilize. It was just that the conditions in Russia were such and so fragile, the economic conditions, and the Tsar's image equally so fragile, that it really wasn't ready for World War I, right? Well, World War I turns out, as we know, right, much longer than they expected. The Russians, notoriously, even amongst themselves, were ill-equipped to go to war. So we're talking at the level of the soldier, right? We said, they didn't have enough arms for their men, so the story was 2 soldiers sent out with one gun, and then when the first one died, it was expected that the second one would take up the gun. That's the tale, right? But whether that's true or not, on the average, it shows you that even the Russians themselves thought they were ill-equipped. At Tannenberg, the Germans killed and or imprisoned over 100,000 Russians. So they defeated the Russian army, and they imprisoned, and I believe the imprisonment was 90,000. So they killed 20,000, and they imprisoned as war prisoners 90,000. That was a huge defeat of the Russians. It really took a lot out of the Russian military. So the losses were just too high all through World War I, and Tannenberg just illustrates one of those, and obviously the biggest one, of those battle losses to the Germans. The home front was in the midst of crumbling. In order to give all they could, which wasn't enough, to the war effort, people were deprived, rationing was going on, the whole problem of toil and hunger for the for the citizens, subjects of the Russian Tsar, right? And at the same time, because there was such demand from the military effort, inflation was happening. So you can imagine people whose wages are going down and inflation is occurring at the same time, and there's deprivation and rationing. The government itself had to police the whole situation, and so was in the act of repression of its own people. So the Tsar was in a quandary. He's fighting the war on one hand, and he's almost fighting a war against his own people on the other in order to get supplies for that war effort. So it was a pretty desperate situation for Nicholas II. Finally, he had a problem in his own court, which probably would have been affected him most at the social level and in the other aristocrats, which means to his army officers, etc. But it didn't look good for the people either. Russia did, after all, have newspapers. What was that problem at court? His wife had taken up with a mystic called Rasputin, and she thought that this mystic could really cure the problem that she had with her son. And Rasputin, as a mystic, had this somewhat large cult following. Many of the women of the court life in Tsarist Russia at least seemed to follow him. They came to the Tsarina's celebrations, houses, parties, in which Rasputin was present. So he was a mystic, and the Tsarina thought that he could cure her son's hemophilia. Hemophilia is a blood disease where your blood won't clot. So if this young kid was bruised, or if he was cut, he would bleed profusely. And she thought Rasputin had the magic and the powers to cure his hemophilia, so she was particularly drawn to Rasputin. And Rasputin himself was particularly drawn to a celebrity career inside of the court, and then that leaked its way out into the public, and so it was a PR problem for the Tsar himself. All right. There would be protests in February 1917, and Nicholas II, who had seen problems for earlier Tsars, abdicated the throne. So he's kind of like Louis the 18th, the Duke of Orleans, who abdicated in 1848 for the French, right? I can see the way the wind's blowing, and these people are dangerous, right? So he abdicates the throne. That doesn't save him or his family, because after the Bolsheviks take over, they will kill him and his family. They take him out to the woods and shoot them. And there's a big thing about whether Anastasia, one of his daughters, was actually shot or not, or lived on. And so there was lots of hoopla about that. They eventually excavated, not too long ago, those the site where the Romanovs were executed. Anyways, he abdicated, right? Riots going on in the streets. You can see, right, the Tsarist regime, its image is affected by Rasputin. It's got a war that it looks like it's making massive losses in, even if it's not necessarily losing or winning at the time. And so he'll abdicate the throne. And for the Romanovs, this was a big tragedy. It was the end of 300 years of Romanov rule in Russia. Here's a picture of the Tsarina's court, and with Rasputin at the center. So he was unique. He dressed himself in peasant outfits. That sounds kind of funny. Peasant garb, right? And he had magnetic eyes, so they say, and you can kind of see his stare was very intense. The aristocrats would find it important to get rid of him at court, so he has a famous death that they tried to poison him first, then they tried to stab him, they shot him, and they threw him in a river and drowned. The autopsy, the story is that the autopsy showed that he finally did die from drowning because his lungs had water in them. So the poisoning, the stabbing, and the shooting did not kill Rasputin, but being thrown in the river to drown, he finally did drown. I don't know what actually happened to him, but that's the story and that's the autopsy. And in fact, they did do an autopsy, and here is Rasputin's dead body. He looks like he almost has a bullet in the brain to me, but perhaps not. Perhaps his head was just bruised in some fashion. But anyways, so those are the things that we learn about his autopsy and about the way he died. Right? All right, how do the Marxists, so we have the Tsar abdicates, and then who are the Marxists, right? So you want to just know that Tsarist Russia has a very lively political life, right? And so there are many parties. Some of them are underground. The Marxists finally are an underground party, or at least they get exiled a lot. They get arrested a lot. The party that they come from, or the most Marxist party at the turn of the century, is the Social Democratic Party. And just so you know, that's not the only party in Russia. There's a constitutional party. There is other revolutionary Marxist parties as well, right? But we'll just note the Social Democratic Party because it splits, and it'll become the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and they are Marxists, and they are led by Lenin, right? So Lenin is the key intellectual figure of the Social Democratic Party. He gains a broad following. As we said, Stalin is one of those followers. So too is Trotsky. Stalin joins in 1906 after the party has split. So in 1903, it splits. The Bolsheviks, and that word means majority, right, will follow Lenin. And the Mensheviks, who are the other faction from the Social Democratic Party, which means the minority, right, will be their competitors, right? Leninism is a particular Marxist philosophy that emphasizes, in addition to Marxist ideas, that there needs to be a vanguard that leads the revolution, that it's important to guard the party line, and you might need to do this by purging those who are your competitors or detractors from the party. He also argues then that there is a dictatorship of the proletariat that's necessary. And these are the things that Lenin adds to Marxism. So he is a Marxist. And Marx didn't have these ideas. He didn't say a vanguard. He didn't say there would necessarily be a dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin is working in a particular world where he feels that he's got a whole, in addition to the urban workers who are very minority of the population, he's got a whole peasantry that he's got to turn into a communist regime, right? And he advocates, as Marx did, for the end of private property, so that's not unusual for a Marxist. The vanguards knew his practical prescriptions for the party line and the necessity sometimes to get rid of your detractors, and that there might be a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat necessary. Lenin saw the vanguard and the dictatorship as temporary, right? The Mensheviks then are the minority party, right? So Menshevik means literally minority, Bolshevik means literally majority, and they were more in the they followed the ideas more of a reform was possible, so cooperation and the bridging of ideas. You don't need to remember so much the Menshevik because the Bolsheviks are going to take over, so make sure you note the Bolshevik party. So between the abdication of the Tsar, February of 1917, and the late October, November revolution, Bolshevik revolution, there's a provisional government. A provisional government's going to try to set up a constitutional government. It's led by moderates. They're known as cadets. They're liberals in the 19th century sense of the word, right? They wanted freedoms and constitutional government. They wanted to allow for capitalism to flourish, right? They were not happy with the revolutionaries, so they thought that the revolutionaries were detrimental to Russia overall. Capitalism, and their one problem was that they believed that they could continue the war effort. And that's where they were wrong. So as the war continued, more and more people sided with the Bolsheviks. The people wanted out of the war, the peasants wanted land, and the Bolsheviks understood that these were the popular desires and that this provisional government that was setting up a constitution had failed to do those things. So from March to November, they set up a constitution. Women and the Soviets would increasingly protest against the government. Women, because they were trying to feed their families, and the war effort was taking food from the mouths of their families. And the Soviets, because the Soviets are a workers' council, usually within particular particular industries, right? So the Soviets were workers' councils within industries. So they were a natural place for workers to come for governance. I mean, that's what the Soviet was all about. If workers had complaints, they could all come together in the Soviet and they could vent those complaints, and then they could work as a bargaining chip with the industrialists themselves. So that was the Soviet, a worker council, right? They're very active against the war effort in particular. Soviets and women too, right? The leader in the provisional government was Kerensky, and he was a moderate and a cadet, and he's going to lose out. The other leader was a military commander, Kornilov. In August, in late summer, Kornilov thinks that he's going to overthrow the provisional government and set up a military dictatorship. And I don't know whether that was a mistake or not, but they stopped him in his effort to create or to overthrow the provisional government. So another, as is Russian, right, another part of the military would up and stop him. The workers and the Marxist leadership allies, and that means the workers become Bolsheviks. That means the Marxists start to take advantage of these Soviet workers' councils as places to voice and to generate support, and they do. Lenin, who is in exile, is returned to Russia. In fact, the Germans understand the benefit to themselves in the war effort. They're fighting Russia. They think, let's get Lenin back into Russia because we know that it's in a revolutionary phase and that these Marxists are the ones that are creating trouble. So the Germans allow for Lenin to take a train through Germany itself, right? And then as Lenin returns, then he becomes an icon for the leadership of the Marxists, and they all push for the end of war, right? And then the Bolsheviks become seen as the people that will end the war. And so in October, there will be a new uprising against the government that had finally created its constitution and was set to have an elected assembly elected, right? And so they, in fact, go through with the elections, and then the Bolsheviks just wipe away that new constitutional assembly. In October, right, fresh protests, right, as things are getting cold in Russia, and you can see the need for material well-being, right? The Soviets and peasants, and they're joined by the soldiers as well, for whom the war effort is going badly, right? The Bolsheviks then cultivate their supporters, right, with the important slogans for their cause, right? And that is peace, we want to get out of the war; land, we want the peasants to have their land; and bread, right? So bread for the people. So that was a slogan for the Bolsheviks that really represented their agenda, that was very appealing to a broad part of the population who were very disenchanted with the Tsarist regime. They also called for all power to the Soviets. So in their campaign to get people to revolt against even the provisional government, they said, we are going to run things from the workers' Soviets position. So all power to the Soviets. So at the end of October, they will seize the provisional government. There's a very famous book, 10 Days That Shook the World, written by John Reed, who was a journalist at the time, and he was in Russia when the October Revolution occurs, or the Bolshevik Revolution occurs. And he describes all the events for the 10 days, very chaotic, right? But they seize government, and the just recently elected Constitutional Assembly will be dissolved, and they will set up a Congress of the Soviets instead, right? So that's their first action, and then also they, according to Lenin's own philosophy, set up a dictatorship of the Bolsheviks. So their idea was, well, the Bolshevik party will have to run this for a little while as a dictatorship, lay down the law, etc., and they're going to have to fight a civil war, so they weren't necessarily wrong about that. And then we will turn to a more free or liberal system, and they never did. In March of 1918, they signed Brest-Litovsk Treaty with the Germans, and that ended the war between Germany and Russia. For Germany, as we agreed in World War I, that was a good thing, except the Americans were coming in on the other side. But nonetheless, they ended the war with the Germans. They gave over the Baltic states to the Germans in this treaty, so they suffered in the treaty in the sense that they lost parts of Russia, right? And then that sort of brings us to the end. The Bolsheviks are in control. They've ended World War I. And then we started the lecture with Stalin right there, where he said, they enter a period of 3 to 4 years of civil war, and they're fighting against everybody. The Cossacks are the biggest cavalry, military, internal Russian resistance to the Bolsheviks. The West, the Germans and the French, send people in to defeat the Red Army. From the East, the Japanese and the Americans send. So we started right there with the Stalin regime when we talked last Wednesday. I will see you guys on Wednesday, and I hope this wasn't too long, but that's my spiel on the Russian Revolution. Take care.